The war dog weighed 90 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and he was loose. He had already knocked a Navy commander flat, shattered a medication cart, and left 3 experienced handlers bleeding on the floor of Kestrel Ridge Military Medical Center. Security had their weapons drawn. The veterinary team was backed against the far wall. Every person in that corridor was screaming for someone to stop him. Every person except one. Claire Weston, a 31-year-old trauma nurse that most of the hospital staff couldn't be bothered to remember by name, stepped forward alone into the empty hallway and held out her hand. The dog stopped. Then he walked to her. And the man who had been laughing at her opinions all week went very, very quiet. Before this story goes any further, if you've never seen a war dog choose someone the way this one chose Claire, you're going to want to stay until the end. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The shift started at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because Claire Weston had learned a long time ago that arriving early was the only way to know what you were actually walking into. She came through the side entrance of Kestrel Ridge Military Medical Center, the way she always did. Badge already out, coffee already gone, shoes already broken in from 2 previous shifts. The hallways at that hour had a particular quality to them, that flat institutional quiet that felt less like peace and more like everything holding its breath. Overhead lighting buzzed at a frequency just below noticing. The cleaning crew pushed their carts around the corners without making eye contact. Claire passed the nursing station on level 2, signed in on the paper log because the digital system had been down for 6 days and nobody had fixed it, and pulled her assignment sheet from the folder marked Whitmore, which was not her name and had never been her name, but correcting it felt like a fight she didn't have the energy for anymore. Her name was Weston, Claire Weston. She had worked at this facility for 14 months. The assignment sheet told her she was back on trauma intake, same as the last 3 days, which meant she was covering for Renata Osgood, who had called out with a back injury that everyone on staff suspected was not entirely genuine. Claire didn't judge it. She had covered for people with worse excuses and would probably do it again. She was clipping her badge to her pocket when she heard the argument coming from the administrative wing. Not words yet, just tone. The particular sharp cadence of someone who was used to being agreed with and had just met a situation that wasn't cooperating. She kept walking. It wasn't her business. It became her business approximately 4 minutes later when Director Hartwell's assistant, a young man named Prescott, who always looked like he'd just received bad news, appeared at the end of the corridor and said, "Weston, we need a trauma nurse in the intake bay. Now. Military transport. It's complicated." "It's always complicated," Claire said, and turned around. The intake bay at Kestrel Ridge was a wide receiving area connected to the east entrance, designed for ambulance drops and emergency transfers. By the time Claire pushed through the double doors, the space had already been colonized by a group of people who made it feel smaller than it was. Navy uniforms, 4 of them. 2 men in civilian tactical gear she didn't recognize. A veterinary technician named Durso, who looked like he was being held upright by his own anxiety. And on the central exam platform, restrained by a heavy-duty nylon lead clipped to 2 anchor points on the table, a German shepherd with a coat the color of dark ash and eyes that were tracking everyone in the room simultaneously. The dog was not aggressive in the way people meant when they used that word casually. He wasn't snapping or barking. He was simply watching with a quality of attention that felt more like threat assessment than fear. And there was a rigidity in his frame that Claire recognized. Not from nursing school, not from the hospital, from somewhere older. "Okay," she said, moving towards the exam table at an angle, not direct. "What are we dealing with?" One of the Navy uniforms turned around. Commander's insignia. Broad through the shoulders, mid-40s, the kind of jaw that suggested he had never in his life been told no and found it instructive. He looked at Claire the way some people looked at furniture, noting presence, assigning no particular significance to it. "We need the veterinary unit," he said. "I'm the trauma intake nurse. I'm here until Dr. Vasquez arrives. What's the animal's injury status?" "He doesn't have injuries. He has a behavioral problem." Claire looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her. She looked away first, slowly, deliberately, in the way that meant something specific if you knew what you were looking for. He has lacerations on his right foreleg, she said. And he's guarding his left flank. What happened? A pause in the room. Durso blinked. The commander's expression shifted into something that looked like mild irritation dressed as patience. I'm Commander Bart Halsey, the man said. This is Kazan. He's been classified as a high-risk working animal following an incident during our last deployment. We transported him here for evaluation and possible reassignment. The vet team was supposed to be ready. The vet team is coming, Prescott said from somewhere near the door. There was a schedule conflict with... I don't need the schedule, Halsey said, and something in the room adjusted very slightly the way things did when a person with rank made clear they were done listening. Claire had moved another 2 feet toward the exam table, not approaching Kazan directly, moving into the space the way you moved into a room where the ceiling was low, just occupying it, not announcing it. Has he eaten today? She asked. That's not... Has he eaten today, Commander? The flatness in her voice was not rude. It was simply unbothered by the inconvenience of his irritation. Halsey looked at her for a moment like he was recalibrating something. No, transport took 12 hours. We were going to feed him after evaluation. 12 hours, Claire repeated. She was now standing at the edge of the exam platform, not touching it, not touching the dog, just present. What's the device on his collar? Standard remote monitoring for behavioral incidents. What kind of monitoring? One of the men in tactical gear shifted. Claire caught it. Telemetry, Halsey said. It tracks vitals. It's standard equipment issued by our contracted support company. What company? Weston. The voice came from behind her, Director Alec Hartwell, who had appeared in the doorway with the particular energy of a man who had not wanted this situation and was now in it. He was 61, had managed Kestrel Ridge for 9 years, and his primary professional relationship with Claire could be accurately described as tolerant indifference. This isn't your intake case. Let the commander get his team sorted. He has lacerations, Claire said, not turning around. Then Durso is scared of the dog, Claire said. I can see it from here. Which means if Kazan moves in the next 3 minutes, Durso is going to do something that makes this worse. So I need 2 minutes, just to stabilize. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone said something true that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Halsey said nothing. Hartwell said nothing. Durso, to his credit, also said nothing, possibly because his mouth was slightly open and no words were ready. Claire turned back to Kazan. She didn't speak to him yet. She didn't make any dramatic gesture. She simply stood at a 30-degree angle to his eyeline and breathed normally, which sounds like nothing but is actually a specific practice. The regulation of your own body's signals, so that the other animal in the room, human or otherwise, doesn't receive alarm from you before you've even opened your mouth. Kazan was watching her. His weight shifted, not toward aggression, toward something more tentative than that. Easy, she said, and her voice had changed. Lower, slower, without the compressed efficiency she used for everything else in the hospital. You've had a long night, I know. She reached toward the exam table edge, didn't reach for him, just rested her hand there, available. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Then, and this was the thing that made Durso take one involuntary step backward. Kazan lowered his head and pushed his nose against her palm. Nobody moved. Commander Halsey said very quietly, "How did you do that?" "I didn't do anything," Claire said. She was examining the foreleg laceration with her free hand, working carefully, and she kept her voice even. "He made a choice. There's a difference." She cleaned the wound. She applied a temporary bandage. She noted the guarding on the left flank, pressed very gently, and felt Kazan tense and then release. She noted the collar, the device on it, the way the indicator light pulsed in a slow sequence that was different from any standard vital monitor she had trained on. She filed that away without commenting on it. The vet team arrived 11 minutes later. Dr. Vasquez, the facility's senior veterinary officer, took over the clinical assessment with practiced efficiency, and Claire stepped back to let him work. She stripped off her gloves, made notes on the intake sheet, and handed it to Prescott. She was almost at the door when Halsey said, "Nurse?" She turned. "Where did you train?" It was a reasonable question. It was also, from the way he asked it, genuinely curious rather than challenging, which was its own kind of information, coming from him. "Here," Claire said. She walked out. She had not lied, technically. She had trained in a lot of places, Kestrel Ridge was one of them. What she had not mentioned was the 3 years before the nursing degree, or the unit she had been attached to, or the places that unit had gone, or the things she had learned in those places that you could not unlearn, things that lived in your hands and your instincts, and the specific particular way you could read a room full of frightened creatures and know exactly how much trouble was coming. That was not information she shared at work. She shared it with no one, actually. She had made that decision when she took this job, and she had kept it for 14 months, and she intended to keep it for however long she remained at Kestrel Ridge, which, based on the morning so far, she was beginning to reconsider. Level 2 was picking up. 2 post-surgical patients needed vitals checks. A family in the waiting area had been there since before she arrived, and needed an update on a status she was not authorized to give them. And the night shift nurse she was relieving, a person named Ormond, had left the medication log in a state that was technically complete and practically useless. Claire fixed the log. She checked the vitals. She found the attending physician responsible for the waiting family and stood in his path until he agreed to go speak to them. At 9:15, her supervisor, charge nurse Beverly Dawn, stopped by the station to review the morning's assignments. Beverly was 49, efficient, and had decided within the first month of Claire's employment that Claire was a competent but uninspiring nurse with no particular clinical ambition, which was an assessment Claire had done nothing to correct because it was easier that way. "I heard you were in the intake bay this morning," Beverly said. "Trauma intake was short. You're not cleared for the military animals." "Durso was there. I assisted until the vet team arrived." "The commander said you interfered with his team." Claire set down the chart she was holding. She picked it back up. "The dog had lacerations. I cleaned them." "Hartwell wants to see you at 11. "I'll be there." Beverly left. Claire looked at the chart in her hands and considered, briefly, the particular mechanism by which a person doing their job correctly could still end up in a director's office being corrected for it. She had seen this mechanism in operation before. She was familiar with it in the way you were familiar with weather. You didn't like it, but you weren't surprised by it. At 11 o'clock, she was in Hartwell's office. Hartwell's office had the quality of a space that was supposed to communicate authority and instead communicated the effort of communicating authority. Plaques on the walls. A desk that was too large. A window that looked out on the parking structure, which was not a view anyone would have chosen, but which he had arranged his chair to face anyway. "You put the facility in a difficult position this morning," Hartwell said. "The dog needed attention. You're a level 2 trauma nurse. You are not a veterinary technician, and you are not a K9 handler." "I know what I am." "Then act like it." He was not unkind when he said it. He was simply very clear, in the way people were clear when they had already decided what the outcome of a conversation was going to be and were working backward from there. Commander Halsey's unit has a formal contract with this facility. They expect protocol. You inserting yourself into a situation you weren't assigned to creates liability. Kazan would have injured someone. That's speculation. It's observation. There's a difference. He looked at her. She looked back. The window behind him showed a level of the parking structure and a concrete pillar, and nothing else. "I'm suspending your intake clearance for 2 weeks, Hartwell said. "You'll remain on standard floor duties. If there's another incident involving the military unit, I'll revisit your employment status." She walked out of his office at 11:17. She did not go home. She went back to the floor, and she completed her shift, and she did not think about what had happened until she was in her car at 6:12 that evening, in the parking structure that was visible from Hartwell's window, sitting with the engine off and her hands on the wheel. 14 months at Kestrel Ridge. A clean record. Good patient outcomes, documented. No formal complaints, none. And a suspension because she had stopped a war dog from hurting someone. She had known this would happen, she realized. Not this exactly. Not the parking structure, not the 612, not the specific geometry of Hartwell's plaque wall, but the shape of it. The general shape. The way her competence made certain people in certain institutions deeply uncomfortable because it suggested, implicitly, that their authority was not the primary relevant factor in every room. She had managed it for 14 months by being quiet. She started the engine. 2 days later, everything changed. She was on her standard floor rotation, mid-afternoon, when her radio crackled with a code she recognized from the emergency protocols. Not a standard patient alert. A facility-wide containment. She heard running in the east corridor before she heard any explanation. Then Durso came around the corner at a speed that his body seemed unprepared for, nearly taking out a medication cart, grabbing the wall with both hands to redirect himself. "Kazan," he said. "He's loose. He took down two of the handlers. He's somewhere in the East Wing, and Halsey's team is... They can't get near him." Claire was already moving. "Where's the last confirmed position?" "B corridor, near the equipment storage, but he's... Weston, he's not biting anyone. He's running. He keeps running into spaces and coming back out and running again." She pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs down. B corridor at Kestrel Ridge was a service hallway, fluorescent lit and narrow, with supply closets on both sides and an equipment cage at the far end. It was not the worst place for a frightened animal to end up. It was also not the best. The lights in that hallway had a flicker she'd complained about twice. A flickering light in an enclosed space with a stressed animal was not a good combination. She heard him before she saw him. Not aggressive sounds, not barking, panting. The specific rapid rhythm of an animal that had been running for a while without getting anywhere. The security team was at the corridor entrance. 4 people, body language tight, radios going. One of them had a tranquilizer set up that he was clearly waiting for authorization to use. Commander Halsey was on the radio with someone. His face had lost the smoothness of early morning authority and replaced it with something raw. He looked up when Claire appeared. "What are you doing here?" "I heard the alert." "You're suspended from intake. This is not your..." "He's not attacking anyone," Claire said. "He's running. There's a difference." She could see Kazan now, at the far end of the corridor, pressed into the angle between the equipment cage door and the wall. His sides were heaving. His eyes were enormous in the flickering light. Every few seconds he would bolt several feet in one direction and then stop, seemingly unable to determine what he was running toward. "He needs to be sedated," Halsey said. "He needs the light to stop flickering," Claire said. "And he needs that device off his collar." Halsey went very still. "That's a monitoring device." "Then monitor it from across the facility," Claire said. "Because whatever it's doing, he associates it with pain. Look at his body language every time the light pulses. Look." Something in Halsey's expression shifted. She didn't wait to find out what the shift was. She walked into the corridor. Behind her, she heard Halsey say something sharp, heard someone else respond, heard the security team make the particular sounds of people who were preparing to stop someone and then didn't. She moved down B corridor at a steady pace, no sudden movements, the flickering light doing its damage to the air around her, but irrelevant to what she was doing. Kazan saw her when she was about 20 feet out. His body went rigid. She stopped. "Let him look." "I know," she said. "This is not what a good day looks like." His ears, which had been flat, moved. Just slightly, just enough. She crouched down, not rushing it, not performing it. Just getting smaller, getting down to his level, being a specific and non-threatening thing in a space that had been full of chaos. He was still panting. She watched the collar device. The light pulsed. She saw his shoulder muscles seize. "I see it," she said, to him, to herself, to nobody. "I see what it's doing." She moved closer, 1 foot, 2 feet. She kept her hands visible and low. He didn't move. He was watching her with the full intense concentration of an animal that was trying to decide if this was going to be another situation where everything got worse. When she was close enough, she reached very slowly for the collar, found the manual release, unclipped the device. The light stopped pulsing. Kazan's shoulders dropped. The sound that came out of him was not a bark and not a whimper. It was something in between, something that had a quality of relief so acute it was almost physical to be near. He pressed his whole body against her, which knocked her sideways into the cage door, and it took her a second to stabilize, both of them leaning against the metal, him pushing into her side and her letting him. The corridor was completely silent behind her. She held the device in her hand. She looked at it. Standard external housing. She'd seen the type. But there was something at the base of it, just below the battery housing, that was not standard. A secondary transmitter she didn't recognize. Small, deliberately small. She turned it over. The manufacturer's mark on the back was not military issue. It was a private label. Letters she didn't recognize from 14 months at Kestrel Ridge. Letters she did recognize from somewhere else entirely. Her hands went still. 3 years, a different life. A warehouse outside a base she wasn't supposed to name. and a briefing she had been part of about a private contractor accused of using modified equipment on working animals, a company that had dissolved before the investigation concluded. A man named Aldrin Voss, who had disappeared with the records and never been charged. She looked at the mark on the device again. The letters were different, the logo was different, but the secondary transmitter at the base was the same design, the same exact design 10 years later. Kazan pressed harder against her side, as if she might leave, as if the weight of him could keep her there. She put her hand on his back and kept it there. The device in her other hand suddenly felt much heavier than the plastic and circuitry it was made of. Because if she was right, and her hands were telling her she was right, her hands remembered things her career at Kestrel Ridge had never been asked to recall. Then Kazan wasn't a behavioral problem. He was evidence. She stayed on the floor of B corridor for another minute, Kazan's weight against her side, the device in her hand, and let herself think. The thinking was not comfortable. It had the specific quality of things clicking into place that you would have preferred to stay unconnected, the satisfaction of recognition, and the dread of implication arriving at the same time. She turned the device over once more, running her thumb along the secondary transmitter housing. The casing was newer. The solder points were cleaner. Someone had gotten better at hiding it in the decade since she'd last seen the design. But the fundamental architecture was identical, and her hands knew it the way hands knew things that had been handled in the dark, under pressure, in conditions where getting it wrong had consequences that mattered. She stood up slowly. Kazan stood with her, stayed at her left leg. When she turned around, the corridor behind her had more people in it than she expected. Halsey was at the front. Behind him, the security team. Behind them, in the space between the door frames, two faces she didn't recognize, civilian clothes, the particular kind of stillness that wasn't relaxed, not medical personnel, and not military, something in between. She filed them without appearing to. Halsey looked at Kazan pressed against her leg, then at the device in her hand. "Give that to me," he said. "I will. I need a secure bag first." His expression shifted. "It's monitoring equipment. Then it'll keep fine in a secure bag." She was not being confrontational. Her voice had the same level quality it had in the intake bay. Not escalating, not backing down, just occupying the exact position she had chosen without apparent concern for whether it was convenient for him. Halsey stared at her for 3 seconds, which was longer than most people stared at her. "Prescott," he said. Prescott materialized from somewhere, as he always did, looking like a man who had been summoned and was uncertain what for. Halsey told him to get an evidence bag from medical storage. Prescott disappeared. Halsey looked back at Claire. "You want to explain what you just did?" "I removed a collar device from a distressed animal. Without authorization." "Yes." "You understand that's—" "I understand that Kazan has been running for 40 minutes and is not injured and has not hurt anyone, which means the protocol of tranquilizing him was premature." She kept her voice even. "I also understand that the device I removed has a secondary transmitter at its base that is not standard military issue. I'd like that fact documented before the bag is sealed." The silence in the corridor was of a different quality than the one in the intake bay had been. This one had weight to it. The two civilians at the back of the group had not moved. One of them, taller, somewhere in his 50s, with close-cropped gray at his temples, was watching her with an attention that felt less like assessment and more like confirmation of something he had already decided. Prescott came back with the bag. Claire placed the device inside it. She did not touch the secondary transmitter again. She sealed the bag herself and handed it to Halsey with both hands, which was a choice, the kind of choice that left no ambiguity about who had handled it last. "Thank you," Halsey said, and the formality of it was slightly wrong, slightly too careful for a man who had spoken to her like furniture 3 days ago. She nodded and walked Kazan back toward the intake bay, which was where he technically belonged and where she technically had no clearance, and nobody in that corridor moved to stop her. Dr. Vasquez was there when she arrived, which helped. He took Kazan's lead with the practiced ease of someone who was good at his job and spent his professional life not being surprised by anything, and Claire gave him a concise rundown of the behavioral incident, the running pattern, the response to the light, the collar device, and the timestamp of its removal, Kazan's physical state before and after. Vasquez made notes. He asked 2 follow-up questions, both clinical, both specific. He did not ask what she was doing down there or why Hartwell's suspension hadn't reached her. "Left flank still guarding," she said. "I'll do a full assessment." The secondary transmitter on the collar was pulsing on a pattern inconsistent with standard biometric monitoring, she said. "I don't know what it was doing, but his muscle response to the pulse was," she paused, "consistent with aversive conditioning." Vasquez stopped writing and looked at her over the top of his glasses. "That's a serious thing to say." "I'm aware. I said I don't know. I'm saying consistent with." He looked at her for another moment. "I'll add it to the assessment." She left the intake bay and went back to the floor because she still had 3 hours left on her shift and 4 patients who needed her regardless of whatever else was happening, and the best way to stay in a position to do anything useful was to not give Hartwell an additional reason to remove her from the building. She did her work. She checked vitals. She updated charts. She handled a family dispute in room 214 that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with 3 siblings who hadn't spoken in 4 years and were now sharing a waiting room. She got them water and found them chairs that weren't adjacent to each other and left them to manage it, which was all she could do. At 4:50 her shift ended and she sat in the break room for 10 minutes before leaving because her legs had made the decision without consulting her. The device was the problem, not the device itself. The device was bagged and cataloged and no longer in her hands. The problem was what the device implied, which was a thread that, if pulled, connected to a time in her life she had very deliberately sealed off. Not hidden. She wasn't operating under delusions about her own psychology. Sealed. The way you sealed a room that was structurally compromised. Not because you forgot it was there, but because opening it casually was how ceilings came down. She had left the army at 26. Not because she'd been asked to leave. Because she had looked clearly at what another 3 years of that work would do to the person she was in the process of becoming, and she had made a choice. She had finished her nursing degree. She'd been halfway through before the service had taken the credits with her, and she had applied to Kestrel Ridge because it was a military medical facility, and she understood military medical facilities, and because the job posting had described a level 2 trauma position with standard hours, and she had wanted, deliberately, something with standard hours. That was the whole plan. It fit on a single index card. She had liked it for its smallness. The device in the evidence bag did not fit on an index card. She drove home, made food she didn't particularly want, sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a database she still had access to from her nursing license, and cross-referenced the secondary transmitter design against publicly available records on contracted military equipment suppliers. She found nothing on the first pass. That was not surprising. If the design had the same origin as the one she'd seen a decade ago, the company would have been deliberately obscured. On the second pass, searching differently, not for the device, but for the company name associated with the private label stamp she'd seen on the back, she found a shell company registered in Delaware, dormant for 8 years, active again, recently, 14 months ago. 14 months. The same month she started at Kestrel Ridge. She closed the laptop. That was a coincidence. That was obviously a coincidence. She was a nurse with a secured past and a suspension on her record and a kitchen table in a mid-range apartment and no reason to be the center of anything. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She was back at the facility before 6 the next morning. Beverly Dawn caught her at the station at 6:20 and reminded her that the suspension from intake remained active and that she was on standard floor rotation for the rest of the week, which Claire acknowledged without dispute because she was not there for intake. She was there because at 6:15, passing through the lobby, she had seen Commander Halsey in the administrative wing with the 2 civilians from the corridor, and the meeting had the closed-door quality of something that was not going to appear in any facility log she had access to. She did her floor rotation. She did it properly, because a person who stopped doing their work when things got complicated was a person who created the conditions for their own removal, and she was not interested in being removed. At 9:40, Durso found her in the supply room. Durso was 24. He had been working at Kestrel Ridge for 8 months, which was long enough to have developed opinions about everyone, and short enough that his opinions were not yet calcified into certainties. He was, Claire had assessed early on, fundamentally decent and currently terrified, which was a combination she had encountered before and found relatively workable. "They moved Kazan," he said. "Where?" "Secure kennel, level 1. But it's not. Vasquez isn't authorized to be down there anymore. Halsey's people took over the assessment." She turned from the supply shelf. Vasquez stepped back. Vasquez was told to step back. By Hartwell. Durso was holding his own hands the way people did when they wanted to do something with them and didn't know what. Claire, I looked at the assessment notes before they sealed the file. Kazan's blood work. There were markers. I don't know what they mean for canines specifically, but for humans, those markers would be consistent with chronic stress response. He blinked. Yeah, that. Plus elevated cortisol and suppressed baseline. How did you... Because it's what a body does when it's been conditioned to expect pain, she said. Human or animal. The physiology is not that different. She picked up the supplies she'd been looking for, which she no longer needed but held anyway. Who has access to the level 1 kennel right now? Halsey's handlers. Prescott's got a key, but I don't think... Not Prescott, Claire said. Who's the tall civilian? Gray temples. 50s. He was in the corridor yesterday. Durso's expression did something complicated. I heard someone say his name. Orel. Garrett Orel. He's from the contracted equipment company. Something tactical. She kept her face still. Garrett Orel. Not a name she recognized, but a name connected to the equipment company, and the equipment company connected to the device, and the device connected to 10 years ago, and a briefing she had attended about a man named Aldrin Voss who had disappeared before he could be charged, and whose company had dissolved, and whose secondary transmitter design was now, apparently, inside the collar of a Navy SEAL's working dog in a military medical facility that had sealed the veterinary records and was not letting the vet back in. Durso, she said, go do your job. Are you going to sit? Go do your job, she said again, not unkindly. And if anyone asks you if we talked this morning, we talked about supply inventory. He left. She stood in the supply room for 90 seconds and made a decision she knew she was not going to be able to walk back from. She found Halsey at 11. He was in one of the facility's consultation rooms, alone, with coffee going cold and a tablet in his hands that he set face down when she knocked and let herself in. He looked tired in a way he hadn't looked 3 days ago. The authority was still there, but it had acquired a crack, something running just below the surface that she recognized as doubt. I'm not supposed to talk to you, he said. I know. Hartwell made it clear that... I know what Hartwell made clear, she said, and sat down across from him without being invited to, which she did deliberately because she needed him to see her as a fixed point rather than as someone who might be managed. I need to tell you something. You don't have to believe me, but I need to say it once and I need you to have heard it. He looked at her for a moment. He picked up the coffee, drank some of it despite it clearly being cold, set it back down. Go ahead. The device on Kazan's collar has a secondary transmitter with a design I've seen before. 10 years ago, in a different context, during my service. She watched his face. I was part of an investigation into a private contractor accused of using modified conditioning equipment on military working dogs. The investigation didn't conclude. The contractor dissolved. The man running it, Aldrin Voss, was never charged. Halsey was not moving. Garrett Orel, she said. Who is he? A pause. He's the regional director for Stormwall Tactical Supply. They've been our contracted equipment vendor for 3 years. Has Kazan's behavior changed in the 3 years you've had the Stormwall contract? The pause this time was longer. And it was a different kind of pause. Not the pause of someone calculating what to say, but the pause of someone recalculating what they already knew. The first incident report, Halsey said slowly, was 14 months ago. 14 months. She let him sit with that. I've worked with Kazan for 6 years, Halsey said, and his voice had shifted. Not emotional, exactly. Men like Halsey didn't do emotional in front of people they'd just met and didn't trust, but quieter, more interior. He was the best trained animal I've ever handled. Textbook. And then it started. Small things at first. Reactivity to sounds he used to ignore. Then to equipment. I thought it was... He stopped. I thought it was age, or stress from the last deployment. I thought I was losing him. You weren't losing him, Claire said. Something was being done to him. You can't know that yet. No, she said. I can't. But the blood work that Vasquez documented before the file was sealed would support it, and the behavioral pattern supports it, and the secondary transmitter supports it, and the fact that Orel is now in this building with the records locked down supports it. She leaned forward slightly. Commander, Who authorized Stormwall's equipment contract? Another silence. That goes above my command level, Halsey said. I know, she said. That's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because if you start pulling that thread, you're going to need to know where you started. He looked at her across the table. The consultation room was very quiet. Down the hall, something rolled by on wheels. A cart, probably. Normal hospital sounds. Everything behaving normally except the thing happening in this room. Who are you? Halsey said. Not the way he'd said it on the first day. Dismissive, rhetorical. He meant it this time. I told you. I'm a trauma nurse. That's what I am now, she said. What I was before isn't documented anywhere that matters to this conversation. But it means I know the difference between a behavioral problem and a manufactured one. And it means I know what the design on that transmitter connects to. And it means you should take what I just told you seriously. She stood up. I'd like access to Kazan, she said, for a proper assessment, with Dr. Vasquez present. Halsey said nothing. She left. She did not know if he believed her. She did not know if it mattered whether he believed her yet, because what she'd given him wasn't a proposition to be agreed with. It was information that, once heard, changed the shape of everything around it. She had learned that in her previous life, the life that didn't appear in her employment file, the way to use information was not to argue with people about it. You gave it to them and let it do its work. She went back to the floor. She checked on her patients. She documented her afternoon chart notes with the same precision she always used, and she helped a post-surgical patient work through a pain assessment that the pain scale was not really equipped to capture. And she stood in the hallway outside room 219 and had a conversation with a man who was scared about his discharge paperwork that had nothing to do with her job description and everything to do with the fact that nobody else had stopped to talk to him. At 2:17, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize. It said, Vasquez has been formally barred from K9 records. Oral personally requested it. The file on the transmitter has been reclassified. You should probably know that. She didn't respond. She deleted the message and then thought about it and retrieved the phone number from her call log and wrote it in her actual paper notebook with a question mark next to it, because whoever had sent that message had access to facility administration records and had chosen to send it to her, which was its own kind of information. She was trying to figure out whether Durso had her personal number when Beverly Dawn appeared at the end of the hall and said, Hartwell wants you, now. The difference this time was that two other people were in Hartwell's office when she arrived. One was a woman she didn't know, early 40s, professional, the particular containment of someone who chose every word before releasing it. The other was Garrett Oral. Oral in person was less impressive than he'd been at the end of the corridor. He was the type of man who manufactured authority with clothing and posture rather than earning it with anything particular. And up close, the gray temples were just gray temples, and the stillness she'd read as threat assessment was actually the stillness of someone who was used to rooms going his way without effort. He looked at her the way Halsey had looked at her on day one, assessing furniture. Miss Weston, Hartwell said, this is Garrett Oral from Stormwall Tactical Supply and Dr. Fiona Marsh from our Medical Oversight Division. They've raised a concern about unauthorized access to secure equipment this morning. I documented the removal in the intake log, Claire said. You removed contracted military equipment without authorization, Oral said. His voice was practiced, smooth, modulated, the voice of a man who had learned to speak in the register of reasonableness, regardless of what he was actually saying. That equipment is proprietary. Its removal compromised an active monitoring protocol. The dog was in acute distress. The dog was being managed by qualified handlers. The handlers had been knocked down and the dog had been running for 40 minutes. Miss Weston, Hartwell said, with the tone of a man who wanted very much for this to end. We're not disputing your intentions. We're disputing the action. The action stopped a 90-pound working dog from hurting someone, she said. If that's the dispute, I'll have it. Oral looked at her. Something in the practiced smoothness developed a very small, very controlled edge. Are you aware, he said, that tampering with contracted military monitoring equipment is a federal matter? The room was quiet. Claire looked at him. Not at Hartwell, not at the woman he'd called Marsh. At Oral directly. Yes, she said. I am. Are you aware that modified conditioning equipment used on active service animals without DoD authorization is also a federal matter? Nobody said anything. I documented what I observed, she said, including the secondary transmitter at the base of the collar device, its pulse pattern, and the animal's response to it. That documentation exists in the intake log and in my personal notes and has been communicated to the attending veterinary officer, whose records I understand have since been sealed. She was careful to keep her voice flat and factual. If that's the concern that brought Mr. Orrell to this office, I think we're talking about different problems. Orrell's expression did not change. That was the thing. It did not change, and the not changing was itself a kind of change, the way a face went still when something behind it had just shifted. Hartwell said, "We're going to need to discuss your employment status." "I know," Claire said. "I'll wait to hear from HR." She walked out. In the hallway, she stood for a moment and made herself breathe normally, because her hands were not shaking, but they were close, and she was not interested in close. She had just said, directly, to a man she believed was connected to a decade-old investigation into criminal abuse of military animals, that she knew what his equipment was designed to do. That was not a small thing to have said. That was a thread she could not put back. She went to the women's restroom on level 2 and ran cold water over her wrists the way she'd done as a medic after the bad ones. Not for feeling, just for the physical interruption of a loop that would otherwise keep running. She looked at herself in the mirror and did not think she looked like someone who had just potentially stepped into something significant. She looked like a tired trauma nurse who needed sleep and probably hadn't eaten enough today, which was also accurate. She dried her hands. She was walking back to the nursing station when she almost collided with Commander Halsey coming out of the stairwell. He caught her elbow. She stepped back. "My office called," he said quietly, not stopping, keeping them both moving as though they'd just met by accident and were having a corridor conversation. 2 hours ago. From the Inspector General's division. She kept walking beside him. About what? About an informal complaint they received regarding Stormwall's K9 equipment contracts. Apparently someone filed a preliminary query 3 days ago. 3 days ago was the morning Kazan arrived. "Who filed it?" she said. "That's the thing." Halsey glanced at her sideways. "They wouldn't tell me, but they're sending someone. Arrives tomorrow morning." He paused. "I thought you should know." He turned and walked the other way. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Someone had filed a complaint with the IG's division the same morning Kazan came through intake, before she'd removed the device, before the corridor incident, before Orrell appeared in Hartwell's office. Someone had known something was wrong before any of this started. She pulled out her phone and looked at the number from the text message again. Then she looked up because someone was at the far end of the corridor watching her. A woman she had never seen before, maybe 35, standing with the casual stillness of someone who was not casual, in civilian clothes that were slightly too practical for hospital visiting. The woman held eye contact for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked through the fire door and was gone. And in the level 1 kennel below them, behind a locked door that Claire had no clearance to open, Kazan sat with his eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for someone to explain what was going to happen next, carrying in his blood and his scars and his exhausted muscles the only evidence that hadn't yet been sealed, reclassified, or transferred to the custody of the man who had put it there. She didn't sleep that night either. She lay in the dark and ran the timeline the way she used to run mission prep, not trying to solve it, just mapping it, letting the shape of it settle into something she could see clearly. Kazan arrived. She removed the device. Orrell appeared. The IG complaint had been filed before any of that happened. The woman in the corridor had watched her and walked through the fire door. The records were sealed. Vasquez was locked out. And somewhere in the facility's administrative wing, Hartwell was having a very bad evening that he had probably convinced himself was her fault. She got up at 4:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out everything she remembered about the briefing from a decade ago. Not on her laptop, on paper, in the compact handwriting she'd developed in the field when paper was the only medium you could trust. She wrote down the design specifics of the secondary transmitter as she remembered them and as she'd observed them on Kazan's device. She wrote down Aldrin Voss's name. She wrote down Stormwall Tactical Supply and Garrett Orrell and the Delaware Shell Company and the reactivation date. She wrote down the timeline. She drew a line connecting the reactivation date to her employment start date and put a question mark next to it because she was not going to assume the connection was causal just because it was temporal, but she was also not going to pretend she hadn't noticed it. She folded the paper twice and put it in the inside pocket of her bag. Then she drove to Kestrel Ridge and arrived at 5:50 and waited. The IG investigator showed up at 7:12. Claire knew it was her before anyone made an introduction because the woman from the corridor, the one with the practical civilian clothes and the 2 seconds of eye contact, came through the main entrance with a credentials folder and the particular walk of someone who had been in more difficult rooms than this one and found them manageable. She was met by Hartwell, who had the look of a man who had also not slept, and by Halsey, who had, and by 2 people from administration whose names Claire didn't know. Claire was at the nursing station. She watched through the glass partition. The investigator's name, which she caught from Prescott's nervous intake form when he logged the visitor, was Dara Sen. No rank visible, no branch insignia, just the credentials and the folder and the way she moved through Hartwell's greeting without appearing to slow down for it. At 9:40, Prescott came to the nursing station and told Claire that Investigator Sen wanted to speak with her at 10. Claire said she would be there. She was in consultation room B at 9:58. Sen arrived at 10:01, which suggested she had been standing outside for a moment before she came in, which was not something Claire would have expected her to need, but which was humanizing in a way she hadn't anticipated. Sen sat down and put a plain notepad on the table between them. No recorder visible. "You're the nurse who removed the collar device," she said. "Yes." "Walk me through it." Claire did. She was precise and sequential, and she did not editorialize because Sen was the kind of person you gave facts to and let draw her own conclusions. She described what she'd observed in the intake bay on day 1. She described the corridor incident. She described the secondary transmitter and its pulse pattern and Kazan's muscle response. She described the manufacturer's mark and the private label stamp and what she had found in the public database that night. She described the briefing from 10 years ago and Aldrin Voss and the investigation that hadn't concluded. Sen wrote for approximately 40% of the time Claire was speaking and did not write for the rest of it. That ratio, in Claire's experience, meant she was already familiar with some of what she was hearing. When Claire finished, Sen said, "How did you recognize the transmitter design?" "I handled the equipment during the investigation. We were trying to reverse engineer what it was doing." "That investigation was classified." "I know. Your involvement in it doesn't appear in your current file." "No," Claire said. "It wouldn't." Sen looked at her steadily. She had a way of directing attention that was very clean. Not aggressive, not performing intensity, just actually present, actually paying attention, which was rarer than it should have been. "Why Kestrel Ridge?" she said. "I wanted a military medical facility. I understood the environment. There are 17 military medical facilities within reasonable distance of where you were living when you applied. You chose this one." Claire held her gaze. "I like the shift structure." Sen wrote something. Then she looked up. "Garrett Orrell's real name is not Garrett Orrell. He has 3 current identities that we've confirmed and possibly more. He is the same individual who operated under the name Aldrin Voss." She said it flatly, in the way of someone delivering information rather than revelation. "He's been operating through subsidiary companies for 9 years. Stormwall is the 4th iteration." The room was very quiet. "The complaint that came to our division 3 days ago," Sen continued, "was filed by a K-9 handler at a different facility. A woman named Sergeant First Class Orinda Breck, who became concerned about her dog's behavioral changes 18 months ago and has been building a case since. She's the reason this investigation is active." She paused. "You're the reason this investigation is here." "Kazan," Claire said. "Kazan's arrival at Kestrel Ridge put Orrell in a facility where he had not anticipated having a problem. Your removal of the device and your documentation of the transmitter gave us physical evidence we didn't have before. 2 things that didn't connect are now connected." Claire sat with that for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "Access to Kazan for an independent assessment. The facility has restricted veterinary access." "I don't have clearance for the level 1 kennel." "You have Halsey," Sen said, "and Halsey has the kennel key." Claire looked at her. "Has Halsey been briefed?" "He was briefed this morning. Sen paused in a way that was not quite hesitation. "He's processing it." Claire nodded. She understood what processing it meant in this context. It meant a man who had trusted his equipment and his contractor for 3 years was now being asked to accept that the dog he thought he'd been losing had been systematically hurt by the tools he himself had used, unknowingly, in every training session, every deployment, every mission where he'd clipped that collar on and given a command, and watched Kazan flinch in ways he'd attributed to stress and age. That was not information that settled quickly. "I'll talk to him," she said. Sen closed her notepad. "One more thing. Aurel is still in the building." "I know." "He does not yet know the scope of what we're looking at. He believes this is a routine equipment complaint. We want to keep it that way for as long as possible." She stood. "Don't give him a reason to move." Claire thought about the meeting in Hartwell's office. The way Aurel's expression had gone still when she'd mentioned the secondary transmitter. "He already knows I'm a problem," she said. "Yes," Sen said. "That's why I need you to be a quiet one." She found Halsey in the break room off the east wing, which was not a room commanders typically occupied, which told her something about the state he was in. He was sitting at the table with a coffee he hadn't touched, and when she came in, he didn't tell her to leave, which told her more. She sat across from him. "How long?" he said, without looking up. "I don't know exactly. The device modification would require contact, someone getting access to the equipment between deployments. They'd need to know your maintenance schedule." "Stormwall serviced the equipment," he said. "Quarterly. They came to us." He set the coffee aside. "I gave them the schedule." She didn't say anything. 6 years, he said. "That dog was... He trusted me completely. The first 2 years he trusted me completely. And then I thought I was losing the connection. I went through handler retraining. I changed my approach. I tried softer commands, harder commands, different reward systems." He stopped. "And all along it was the caller." "Not all along," she said. "The device wasn't modified until Stormwall got the contract. Whatever you had before that was real. The 6 years you built with him were real." He looked at her then. "He chose you," she said. "In the corridor. He was loose and disoriented and running from something that had been hurting him, and he came to me because I took the device off. But when it was time to calm down, he looked at you. I noticed that." She paused. "That's not something you manufactured. That's his." Halsey was quiet for a long moment. "Sen wants access to the kennel." "I know. Hartwell has been told to maintain restricted access pending review. If I give Sen and Vasquez in, I'm going around Hartwell." "You're going around Aurel," Claire said. "Hartwell is just the mechanism." Something shifted in his expression. Not fully resolved, there was still too much that wasn't settled, but the direction of it was cleaner. "What do you need from me?" "Unlock the kennel, get Vasquez there, and don't tell Prescott." Halsey almost did something with his mouth that might, in a different atmosphere, have been the beginning of a smile. "Prescott talks. Prescott always talks." They did it at 1:15 during the administrative lunch window that predictably cleared the level 1 corridor. Halsey unlocked the kennel with his own key. Vasquez was already in the hallway when they arrived. Claire had texted him at noon with 3 words, level 1, 1:15. He had texted back, K9 kit or full. She had texted back, full. He had not replied further, which meant yes. The kennel had 4 individual enclosures. 3 were empty. Kazan was in the 4th, and when the door opened, he came to his feet with the combination of alertness and wariness that had become his baseline. He looked at Claire, then at Halsey, then at Vasquez, who he didn't know, and his ears went back. "Slow," Claire said to Vasquez. Vasquez was already moving slowly. He had been a veterinary officer for 11 years and did not need to be told how to enter an animal's space, but he acknowledged it with a nod that was also a thank you, which was the kind of professional courtesy that actually meant something. Halsey stayed at the door. That was his choice, and the right one. Giving Kazan room, not pressing into the space, not making it about the reunion he probably wanted to have at some point, but which was not the priority right now. The assessment took 40 minutes. Vasquez was thorough in the way good clinicians were thorough, not rushing, not performing thoroughness, just actually doing the work. He drew blood. He documented the scarring on Kazan's neck, which was more extensive than the initial intake assessment had captured because the initial assessment had been interrupted before it was complete. He documented the left flank guarding and its likely cause. He tested reflex responses and recorded the patterns. Claire assisted and watched and kept herself at Kazan's sightline whenever Vasquez needed to do something that would cause discomfort, so that the thing Kazan saw while he was being hurt was a familiar face and not a stranger. At 2:03, Vasquez said quietly, "This is not behavioral." I know, Claire said. The scarring on the cervical area. This has been accumulating for months, maybe longer. This wasn't an incident. This was systematic. He looked at her over Kazan's back. I need to get this to Sen's team. Yes. The blood results will take time we may not have. Get them started. I'll figure out the time. She left Vasquez with Halsey and Kazan and went back upstairs and was on the floor and checking a post-surgical patient's drainage output by 220, and nobody in the administrative wing appeared to know what had happened in level 1. And Oral was still in the building, and the shape of the situation was changing. It changed faster than she expected. At 3:40, Beverly Dawn came to the floor with an expression that had moved past irritation into something more uncomfortable. HR wants you at 4, she said. About my employment. I assume. Beverly hesitated, which was not a thing Beverly typically did. Claire, whatever you've gotten yourself into. I haven't gotten myself into anything. Hartwell is going to terminate you, Beverly said. I think that's what this is. Claire looked at her chart. Then I'll hear it at 4. She finished the chart. She checked on the 3 other patients. At 3:52, she went to the restroom and washed her hands and looked in the mirror and told herself, flatly, that this was the part where things got worse before they got better, and that worse before better was a pattern she had survived before, and that the relevant question was not whether she was going to be fired, but whether the 40 minutes in the level 1 kennel had been enough time for Vasquez to get what was needed. She believed it had. She went to HR at 4 o'clock. The HR officer's name was Candace Muir, and she was professional in the way that made professionalism feel like distance, and there was a folder on her desk with Claire's name on it that was thicker than it should have been for 14 months of clean employment. Hartwell was not in the room, which was slightly surprising. Oral was not in the room, which was not. We're initiating a formal review of your employment status, Muir said, effective immediately. Pending the outcome of the review, you are placed on administrative leave. With pay? With pay, yes. What are the grounds? Unauthorized access to restricted patient, she paused. Restricted animal welfare records, unauthorized removal of contracted military equipment, and a breach of the facility's chain of command protocols. Claire looked at the folder. Is the documentation in that file from this week or from before I arrived? Muir looked up. Because if Garrett Oral provided any of the documentation currently in that file, Claire said, Investigator Sen from the IG division is going to want to see it, so I'd hold off on sealing it. Muir's expression did a complicated thing. I'm not refusing the review, Claire said. Administrative leave is fine. I just want that folder to still exist in its current form tomorrow morning. She surrendered her badge. She got her personal items from the break room locker. She walked to the main exit and pushed through the door into the dry afternoon and stood for a moment in the parking lot with her bag on her shoulder and the paper in her inside pocket and the particular feeling of having gone as far as she could go from inside the building. She was at her car when her phone rang, number she didn't recognize, different from the first one. She answered, Ms. Weston. A man's voice. Not Halsey, not Durso. Measured, the vocal equivalent of the practical civilian clothes Sen had been wearing, the sound of someone who operated in the space between official and unofficial. My name is Kellard. I'm with Investigator Sen's field team. We need you to come back into the building. I was just placed on administrative leave. I know. Come back anyway. Use the east entrance. Why the east entrance? A pause. Because the west entrance is where Mr. Oral's vehicle is currently parked, and in the last 20 minutes he has made 3 calls to a number in Delaware that we've been monitoring for 6 weeks, and we'd prefer he not see you re-enter the building. She was already moving toward the east entrance. What happened? Dr. Vasquez's preliminary assessment reached our team at 3:30. We've been waiting for corroboration on one specific element of the secondary transmitter's function. Another pause, briefer this time. We have it. The transmitter wasn't monitoring biometrics. It was delivering aversive stimulus. Low-level electrical pulse, calibrated to appear as minor behavioral response in standard records. Repeated exposure over months produces the pattern you observed. Avoidance, hypervigilance, suppressed baseline. In a working dog, it looks like deterioration, like the animal is failing. She pushed through the east door. The corridor was empty. And it creates a need for rehabilitation, she said. Which Stormwall Tactical Supply is contracted to provide, Kellard said. at significant cost, for a condition they manufactured. He paused. Kazan is not the only dog. I know. We've confirmed 9 active cases across 3 facilities, possibly more. The pattern tracks to every facility that holds a storm wall equipment contract. His voice stayed level. Ms. Weston, Orel knows the investigation is not routine. We believe those 3 calls were to people with legal authority to pull the physical records before we can subpoena them. We have maybe 6 hours before that becomes a problem. She was moving through the east corridor toward the interior of the building. What do you need? Halsey, he said. Specifically, we need Halsey to formally transfer custody of Kazan to the IG investigation before Orel can argue the dog is Stormwall's contracted equipment for the purpose of evidence suppression. That's a thing they can do? Their contract has a clause, Kellard said. They wrote it in 3 years ago, and nobody flagged it because nobody was looking for it. If Orel invokes it before we have formal custody transfer, Kazan leaves this facility tonight. She stopped walking. Not because she needed to think. She had already done the thinking. She stopped because she wanted one clear moment before the next part, and she gave herself exactly 3 seconds of it, and then she kept walking. Where's Halsey now? She said. Level 1 kennel. He hasn't left. She took the stairwell down. The kennel was exactly as she'd left it, except that Vasquez was gone, and Halsey was sitting on the floor outside Kazan's enclosure with his back against the wall, and Kazan pressed against the mesh door, the dog's head as close to Halsey as the barrier allowed. She looked at the 2 of them for a moment before Halsey registered she was there. They sent you back, he said. Kellard, she said. Yes. We need you to formally transfer Kazan's custody to the IG investigation. Right now, before Orel invokes his contract clause. Halsey looked at her, then at Kazan. And if I do that, what happens to him? He becomes evidence in a federal investigation. He gets proper care. He's protected. After the investigation? I don't know, she said. I don't know what after looks like. But right now, Orel has the legal mechanism to pull him out of this facility tonight. And if that happens, the chain of evidence goes with him. Halsey was quiet. Kazan made a low sound through the mesh. Not distress exactly. The particular vocal register of an animal that was paying attention to a conversation it couldn't follow but understood the emotional weight of. 6 years, Halsey said again. Not to her this time, to Kazan, or to himself, or to the space between them that had been damaged by someone else's calculation and was now, possibly, at the beginning of something else. He got up. They found Kellard in the conference room adjacent to the administrative wing, with Sen and 2 people with laptops and the organized controlled urgency of a team that was working against a clock they couldn't see but could feel. Halsey signed the custody transfer. Sen countersigned. It was 4:47. At 4:51, the door to the conference room opened without a knock. Garrett Orel came in. He was not alone. There was a man behind him. Not military, not medical, the specific type of person that money hired when it needed authority to look like it had already won. And behind them both was Hartwell, who had the expression of someone who had been brought along and was no longer certain why. Orel looked at the table, at the signed custody transfer, at Halsey, then at Claire. The practiced smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had changed in the same way that surfaces changed just before they cracked. Not visible yet, but present, registered by instinct before it became available to the eye. You're outside your authority, he said to Sen. Investigative authority under IG directive extends to all personnel and contractors operating within the facility's scope, Sen said. Your company's contract falls within that scope. The custody transfer is premature. We have the contractual clause requires notification to the facility director and the contracting officer, Sen said. The notification window is 72 hours. You're approximately 71 hours and 9 minutes early. The man behind Orel said something quietly. Orel did not respond to it. Additionally, Sen said, we've executed a hold on Stormwall's physical records at your registered office. A federal marshal is there now. She looked at him directly, without performance, without pressure, just the simple factual clarity of someone who held every card she needed. Mr. Orel, we know what the device was doing. We have the transmitter. We have the assessment. We have the custody transfer. And we have 9 other cases that connect to your company's equipment contracts across 3 facilities. Hartwell said softly. Garrett, Orell looked at him. Hartwell looked back, and in that look Claire could see the precise moment a person understood that the relationship they had built with someone had been built on something that wasn't real, and the understanding was not dramatic. It was just flat and cold and very clear. "I want counsel," Orell said. "That's your right," Sen said. "Agent Kellard will ensure you have access to a phone." She nodded to Kellard. Kellard moved to Orell's side. And in that moment, in the flat institutional light of a conference room in a military medical facility, with the paperwork signed and the clock running and 10 years of a thread finally pulled to its end, Claire Weston stood at the edge of the room and felt something that was not triumph, not satisfaction, not the clean feeling of conclusion that the movies suggested this moment should have. What she felt was tired, and underneath the tired, something older, the particular relief of a person who had been holding a thing at arm's length for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. She turned to leave. Behind her, Sen said, "Weston." She turned back. "The 9 other facilities," Sen said. "We need someone who can assess the animals, someone who understands the behavioral indicators and can be present for the welfare evaluations." She paused. "Someone the dogs will accept." Claire looked at her. "I was placed on administrative leave 2 hours ago." "I know." Sen looked back at her. "How fast can you pack?" Before Claire could answer, Halsey appeared in the doorway behind Sen. He had his phone in his hand. His expression had the kind of controlled alertness she was beginning to recognize as his version of urgency. "We have a problem," he said. "What kind?" Sen said. "The kind that's moving." He held up the phone. The screen showed a facility alert from a military installation 2 hours south of Kestrel Ridge. One of the dogs at Northgate, a Belgian Malinois named Archer, went into acute neurological distress 30 minutes ago. The handlers can't get near him. The on-site vet is recommending emergency sedation. Sen looked at Claire. Claire was already thinking. Acute neurological distress in a dog exposed to aversive conditioning over months could mean any of several things, and some of them were time-sensitive in a way that sedation would only delay. And if the Northgate installation had a storm wall equipment contract, and the device was still active and nobody there knew to remove it yet. "Is the device still on him?" she said. Halsey spoke into the phone. Waited. "Yes." Claire looked at Sen. "How fast can you drive?" Sen said. 2 hours, she said. "Less if Kellard drives." Kellard looked at Sen. Sen nodded once. That was the whole exchange. They were moving in 4 minutes. Claire, Kellard, and Halsey, who had invited himself with the specific quiet of a man who understood that his presence was relevant and did not wait to be told. Sen stayed at Kestrel Ridge to manage Orell's detention and the records hold and the 11 other things that were simultaneously requiring her attention. She walked them to the east exit and handed Claire a secure phone and said, "Vasquez's full report goes to the federal prosecutor's office at 6. Whatever you find at Northgate, document everything before you touch anything." "I know," Claire said. "I know you know," Sen said. "I'm saying it anyway." They took Kellard's vehicle, which was unremarkable in every visible way and moved considerably faster than its appearance suggested. Halsey sat in the back with his own phone and spent the first 40 minutes coordinating with Northgate's commanding officer, a colonel named Stewart, who was professional and cooperative and deeply unhappy about the situation in the way that people were unhappy when something that had been happening in their facility turned out to have been happening without their knowledge. Claire sat in the front and watched the highway and thought about Belgian Malinois physiology and the specific complications of acute neurological presentation in a working dog that had been under chronic aversive conditioning, which was a different set of considerations than the same presentation in a dog that hadn't, and the difference mattered for how you approached it. Kellard drove and said nothing, which she appreciated. At the hour mark, Halsey got off the phone. "Stewart has the facility vet standing by. They've isolated Archer in the veterinary suite. Handlers are outside the room." He paused. "The device is still on him. They tried to remove it once. He reacted." "He bit someone?" "Nearly." Stewart pulled the handlers back. "Smart," she said. "The vet recommended sedation again." "What's his respiratory rate?" Halsey leaned forward and relayed the question into the phone. Waited. 42. "That's high, but not critical. Tell them to hold the sedation and keep the room as quiet as possible. No loud commands, no sudden movement, and if anyone has anything that emits an electronic signal, phone, radio, monitoring equipment, get it out of the room or power it down. Halsey looked at her. The device pulses in response to nearby electronic signals? I don't know for certain, but Kazan's worst moments correlated with crowded rooms with a lot of active equipment. I'm not ruling it out. He relayed the instructions. They drove. Northgate Military Installation was 40 minutes south of the highway exit and 40 years into the institutional aesthetic of its original construction. Low buildings, high fencing, the organized permanence of a place that had never had any interest in appearing welcoming to people who weren't supposed to be there. They were cleared through the gate at the 47-minute mark. A young specialist named Groff met them at the gate and drove them to the veterinary suite in a utility vehicle at a speed that suggested he had been told to hurry. The veterinary suite at Northgate was better equipped than Kestrel Ridge's kennel, but was currently organized in the particular way of spaces where something had gone wrong and everyone was waiting to find out how wrong. 3 handlers stood outside the door. The facility vet, a compact man named Dr. Brannick, met them in the corridor with the expression of someone who was relieved to see people who might know more than he did. He's calmer than he was, Brannick said, but still presenting with muscle tremors and photosensitivity. His third eyelid is showing. Every time I get close to the collar, he reacts. What's the device model? Claire asked. Brannick handed her a printed specification sheet. She looked at it. The model number was different from Kazan's newer revision, but the manufacturer's mark in the corner of the spec sheet was the same private label stamp she'd memorized. Same family. Possibly upgraded. She handed the sheet to Kellard, who photographed it and kept it. I need to go in alone, she said. Brannick looked at her badge. No badge, she'd surrendered it. Then at Kellard's credentials, then at Halsey's uniform. She's qualified? He asked Halsey. More than I am for this, Halsey said. Brannick moved aside. She went in. Archer was in the far corner of the room, pressed into the angle where 2 walls met, which was a different defensive geometry than Kazan had used, but the same underlying logic. Maximum visual coverage, minimum surface area exposed. I was a dark sable Malinois, probably 4 years old, smaller than Kazan but wound tighter, the kind of dog that had been built to be fast and precise and was now burning that capacity as pure agitation because there was nothing to redirect it toward. The muscle tremors Brannick had described were visible across his shoulders. His breathing was audible. Claire stopped just inside the door and let it close behind her. She did not move. She did not speak immediately. She let him look at her and adjust to her presence, which took longer than it had with Kazan because Archer did not know her and because whatever was running through his system right now was further along than Kazan's had been in the corridor. After 90 seconds, she said, I see you. Not to accomplish anything specific, just to give him sound in a register that wasn't alarming. His ears moved. She crouched down. The floor was cold. She could feel it through the knees of her scrubs, which she was still wearing from the shift she had not finished. She had not eaten since morning. She was aware of both of these things, the way you were aware of background conditions that were not currently the priority. She moved forward in increments. When he tensed, she stopped. When he stayed still, she moved. It took 11 minutes to cross the room, which was not small, and by the end of it her knees ached and her back had an opinion about the crouch that she was going to hear about later. But she was close enough. She could see the device clearly now. Same basic form factor as Kazan's, but with a slightly different collar mount, and what appeared to be a hardened outer casing on the transmitter. Someone had improved the durability. Below the battery housing, the secondary transmitter. Pulse light currently off, which was possibly why Archer was calmer than he'd been. She reached up. Archer's whole body went rigid. Easy, she said, and her voice was exactly the same as it had been in the B corridor, in the intake bay, in the 11 minutes crossing this floor. Level, unhurried, not performing calm but actually occupying it, which was a different thing, and animals, in her experience, knew the difference. I'm going to take it off, that's all. His breath came in short bursts against her forearm. She found the manual release on the collar. It took 3 seconds to locate it on this model. Slightly different position than Kazan's, another upgrade. She unclipped the device. Archer collapsed against her. Not collapsed. That was the wrong word. It implied failure, and what Archer did was not failure. He simply stopped holding himself together in the particular rigid way he'd been holding himself together, and the weight of him hit her side and knocked her sideways, and she let it, went with it, ended up sitting on the cold floor of the veterinary suite with a 40-pound Belgian Malinois pressed against her, and his chin on her thigh, and the device in her right hand, and nothing in the room making any sound at all. She documented the device before she bagged it, photographed the secondary transmitter, the pulse light housing, the private label stamp, sent the photos to Kellard's number on the secure phone. Then she bagged it properly and sealed it and sat there for another 4 minutes while Archer got his breathing back. When she finally came out, the corridor was more crowded than it had been. Brannick, Kellard, Halsey, the three handlers, Groff, and Colonel Stewart, who was 50-something, weathered, with the particular stillness of a long-serving officer who had just been informed that something was happening in his command that he had not authorized, had not known about, and was going to spend the next considerable period of time being accountable for regardless. He looked at her. She handed Kellard the sealed evidence bag. Stewart said, "Who are you exactly?" "Claire Weston. I'm a trauma nurse from Kestrel Ridge." He looked at her for a long moment. "A trauma nurse." "The paperwork on my previous work history is classified," she said. "Investigator Sen has the relevant clearance. But right now your dog is stable and the device is documented, and I need Dr. Brannick to do a full welfare assessment while the aversive stimulus is no longer active." Stewart looked at Brannick. Brannick went back into the room. Stewart looked back at Claire. "How many facilities?" "We've confirmed 9, including this one," Kellard said. "Possibly more." The colonel's face did not dramatically change, but something in it settled into a harder shape. "How long has this been going on?" "Minimum 18 months, possibly longer. The behavioral changes were consistent with natural deterioration in the early stages, which is why they weren't flagged." "Who built the system?" "The man currently detained at Kestrel Ridge," Kellard said. Stewart said nothing for a moment. Then, to no one in particular, "We paid them to do this." Nobody responded because there was nothing to say to that which made it better. They stayed at Northgate for 2 hours. Claire assisted Brannick through the welfare assessment, which confirmed the same markers Vasquez had found in Kazan: chronic stress, accumulated aversive conditioning, suppressed baseline. She documented everything in the format Sen had specified and sent it encrypted to Kellard's secure server. She drank coffee that someone brought her. Terrible coffee. The kind that military installations produced with the same consistency they produced most things. And ate half of a protein bar that Halsey produced from somewhere, and did not ask where he'd been keeping it. At 7:40, Sen called. "Orel's attorney arrived at 6:15, she said without preamble. "He's been in with him since then. The records hold at the Delaware office is confirmed. We have physical custody of 11 filing cabinets and 3 server drives. The federal prosecutor's office received Vasquez's report at 6 and has been in motion since." A brief pause. "There's something else." "Tell me," Claire said. "The Delaware Shell Company, the one that reactivated 14 months ago. We pulled its incorporation records. One of the registered officers is a person named Donal Whitmer." She paused. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Claire thought. "No." Whitmer was listed as a consulting administrator at Kestrel Ridge Medical Center from 3 years ago to 18 months ago. He left before you arrived, but his name appears in the equipment contract documentation as the internal advocate for the Stormwall account. She stood very still. "Someone inside Kestrel Ridge wrote Stormwall's contract in," she said. "And someone inside Kestrel Ridge has been, we believe, ensuring the contract remained protected from standard review," Sen said. "We're pulling Whitmer's full record now. But it means Orel had an inside line at your facility, which raises the question of whether your hire was monitored," Claire said, "or anticipated." The words sat in the air of the Northgate corridor. "My clearance level from my previous service," Claire said carefully. "Would it have flagged in a background check run by someone with access to defense contractor networks?" "It would flag as sealed," Sen said, "classified. Someone who knew what they were looking at might recognize the pattern. Previous service, sealed records, nursing degree, application to a military medical facility. Someone who knew what they were looking at would know I'd been involved in the original investigation," Claire said. "Yes," Sen said. She thought about the reactivation date, 14 months ago. The same month she'd applied to Kestrel Ridge. She had told herself that was obviously a coincidence. She had made herself believe it because the alternative was a level of deliberate targeting that was difficult to absorb. He wanted me close, she said. We think so. Someone with your background on staff in a facility where Stormwall had a contract. It could have been leverage, or a way to monitor whether the old investigation was resurfacing through the people who'd been part of it. Or he thought he could manage me, Claire said. Get ahead of it if I started looking. Possibly all three, Sen said. We're still pulling the thread. But I wanted you to know. She ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. Kellard was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had heard one side of a significant phone call. Change of shape, she said. What kind? The kind where the thing I thought I walked into turns out to have been arranged, she said. Someone put me at that facility, not randomly. Kellard absorbed this. Does it change what you do next? She thought about it. No, she said. It changes what I feel about it. That's different. They drove back to Kestrel. It was past 9 when they arrived. The administrative wing had lights on that shouldn't have been on at that hour, which meant the facility was running processes that its normal hours hadn't anticipated. Halsey was on his phone again as they came through the east entrance, and Groff, who had apparently followed them back from Northgate in a separate vehicle for reasons that weren't immediately clear, was trying to find a parking space that didn't require a permit. Sen met them inside. Her expression had the specific quality Claire had come to read as controlled urgency. Not alarm, because Sen did not do alarm, but the look of a timeline that was being managed and was currently manageable and required continued management to stay that way. Orel's attorney has filed an emergency injunction, she said, arguing that the custody transfer of Kazan was procedurally improper because the facility director was not given notice. Hartwell wasn't notified before we signed the transfer, Halsey said. No, Sen said, which is the argument. The injunction is being reviewed by a duty judge. We have until midnight tonight. What happens at midnight? If the injunction holds, the custody transfer is voided, and Kazan's status reverts to Stormwall's contractual control, pending a formal review that their attorney will ensure takes 8 to 12 months. She looked at Halsey, which means he leaves this building tonight. Halsey's jaw tightened. How do we beat the injunction? Claire said. We need the facility director's formal endorsement of the custody transfer, Sen said. Retroactively, it's procedurally available as a corrective measure if Hartwell signs before midnight. Hartwell isn't going to sign, Halsey said. He's been protecting Stormwall's contract since Hartwell didn't know what the contract was protecting, Claire said. Both of them looked at her. He's not Orel's accomplice, she said. He's Orel's casualty. Whitmer pushed the contract through before Hartwell fully understood what it contained, and by the time he might have looked harder at it, it was established, and the incentive to question it had passed. She paused. He's a bureaucrat who got used. That's different from what Orel is. It doesn't make him likely to sign, Halsey said. No, she said. But it makes him persuadable. She found Hartwell in his office at 9:43. He was there without his jacket, which was a thing she had never seen, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 5 hours being shown the interior of a situation he had been living on the outside of without knowing it, and the view was not agreeable. He looked up when she came in. He didn't tell her she wasn't supposed to be there. That was the first indication. You were placed on administrative leave, he said. Yes, she said. I know, I need 10 minutes. He gestured at the chair across from his too large desk. She sat down and she told him clearly and without performance what Donal Whitmer's name meant, and what the Delaware Shell Company connection meant, and what had been happening in his facility under his contract for the past 14 months. She told him what they'd found at Northgate. She told him about the injunction and the midnight deadline and what happened to Kazan if the deadline passed. Hartwell listened. He did not interrupt, which was not his usual pattern. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds, which in a room that silent felt considerably longer. I should have looked harder at the Stormwall contract, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. He looked at her. She did not soften it, because softening it would have been condescending, and he deserved the truth in its actual shape. If I sign the endorsement, he said, I'm formally acknowledging that a contract in my facility was used for fraud and animal abuse on my watch. You're acknowledging that you're correcting a procedural oversight in a custody transfer, she said. The rest of it is going to come out regardless of what you sign. What the signature determines is whether one dog leaves this building tonight. He was quiet again. Then he picked up the phone and called Sen's number and said, "Send me the document." She was outside his office when the endorsement went through at 10:51. Kellard confirmed it from the conference room. The duty judge denied the injunction at 11:17. Kazan's custody transfer held. She sat down on a bench in the administrative hallway and did nothing for a full 3 minutes, which was the most deliberate nothing she had managed in approximately 36 hours. Then Kellard came out of the conference room and said, "There's a press situation developing at the main entrance." She looked up. Orel's attorney issued a statement to 2 journalists before the injunction was denied, he said. The statement characterizes the IG investigation as an overreach targeting a legitimate defense contractor and claims that a dismissed nurse with a sealed military record is the source of fabricated evidence. She stared at him. "It names you," he said, "by name, and it describes your administrative leave as a termination for cause." She considered this. "When did the statement go out?" 40 minutes ago, before the injunction was denied, before Northgate, before the endorsement." He paused. "Before the federal prosecutor filed the emergency motion we just received, which is sealed until morning, but which I'm told is substantial." She stood up. "What's Orel's status right now?" "Detained in a conference room with his attorney and 2 federal agents. He's been cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when their attorney tells them to say nothing, and cooperating means saying nothing." "And the journalists?" 2. "Main entrance. They have the statement. They don't have the response yet." Kellard looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who was not going to tell her what to do. "Sen can handle the press response. It doesn't have to be you." She thought about a dismissed nurse with a sealed military record and fabricated evidence. She thought about 14 months of being called Whitmore, about a folder in HR that was thicker than it should have been, about Kazan in B Corridor choosing her, and the look on Halsey's face when he finally understood what 6 years had actually meant. She thought about Orel, who had placed her at this facility and waited to see what she would do, and had apparently decided that she would do nothing, and had been wrong. "I know," she said to Kellard. "It doesn't have to be me." She straightened her scrubs. "But I've been quiet for a long time," she said, and walked toward the main entrance. The 2 journalists were outside the glass, one with a camera, one with a recorder, both with the patient, predatory energy of people who had a story and were waiting for confirmation of which direction it pointed. The facility's security officer was positioned at the door. He looked at Claire and then looked at his radio and clearly decided the radio was not going to help him here. She pushed through the door. The journalist with the recorder, a woman, late 30s, with the practiced economy of movement of someone who had done this in bad weather and good, looked at her and said, "Are you Claire Weston?" "Yes," she said. "Do you have a response to Stormwall Tactical's statement characterizing the current investigation as Stormwall Tactical's contractor is currently detained in this building?" Claire said. "His attorney issued a statement 40 minutes ago describing me as a dismissed nurse with a fabricated account. At midnight tonight, a federal judge denied an emergency injunction that would have removed the primary evidence animal from this facility. The federal prosecutor's office received our investigative documentation at 6 o'clock this evening." She kept her voice level. "I'm not dismissed. I'm on administrative leave. There's a difference. And I would suggest that anyone reporting on this story wait for the federal prosecutor's filing in the morning before deciding which direction it points." The journalist with the recorder said, "Can you describe what you found at—" "Tomorrow," Claire said, "after the filing." She went back inside. The security officer held the door for her, which was not a thing he had done on any previous morning, and she registered it without comment. She was halfway down the administrative hallway when her secure phone buzzed. "Sen. Text, not call. 4 words. Check the kennel cameras." She found the nearest monitor station, logged in with the temporary credentials Kellard had given her, pulled up the level 1 kennel feed. Kazan was in his enclosure, standing, looking at the camera with the direct, clear attention of a dog that was no longer running from anything. And sitting against the wall outside his enclosure, on the floor in the B corridor posture she now recognized as Halsey's version of staying close without crowding, was the commander, who had apparently been there for the last 2 hours without telling anyone. She looked at the feed for a moment. Then the second camera, the one covering the kennel corridor entrance, showed movement. A figure, coming through the door, moving with purposeful familiarity toward the enclosures. Not a handler she recognized, not Brannick, not anyone from Sen's team. The figure reached Halsey's position and crouched down beside him, and in the low-resolution gray of the kennel camera feed, Claire could make out an exchange, something handed from the figure to Halsey. Small, rectangular, a drive, a data drive. Halsey looked at it. Then he looked at the figure, and the figure straightened and turned, and for exactly 2 seconds, the kennel camera caught the face. It was Donal Whitmer. She was moving before she finished processing what she'd seen. The monitor station was on level 2. The kennel was level 1. She took the stairs because the elevator had a 3-second delay that she didn't have patience for, and she was through the stairwell door and into the level 1 corridor in under 40 seconds, which was fast enough that she was breathing harder than she wanted to be when she pushed open the kennel door. Halsey looked up. Whitmer was still there. That was the first thing. Whitmer had not run, which told her something about how he read the situation, or how he'd been told to read it, or how much he understood about what was currently happening in the building above them. He was standing beside Halsey with the data drive still in the space between them, and he was a man in his late 40s with a forgettable face and the specific posture of someone who had spent years being the person in the room that nobody paid attention to, which was, she now understood, a professional asset he had cultivated deliberately. Kazan, in his enclosure, was watching all three of them. "Claire," Halsey said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not alarm, not command, something more uncertain than either. He came to help. "I need Kellard down here," she said. Not to Halsey. She already had the secure phone out. "He's not Orel's man," Halsey said. "He's... just listen to him." She texted Kellard the kennel location and then looked at Whitmer and said, "Talk." Whitmer had the look of a person who had rehearsed this and was now finding that the rehearsal hadn't fully prepared him for the room. He was holding himself still in the way of someone managing considerable anxiety through visible effort. "I was approached by Orel, by Voss, 4 years ago," he said. He needed an internal contact at a facility with a strong K-9 program and existing military contracts. He offered consulting fees. I made a bad decision." "You wrote the Stormwall contract into Kestrel Ridge," she said. "Yes." "And you monitored who Hartwell hired." A pause. "I was asked to flag certain applicant profiles. People with sealed military records. Specifically anyone who'd been involved in DoD investigations between 12 and 15 years ago." He stopped. "When your application came through, I reported it. Voss told me to make sure you were hired. He wanted me where he could watch me." "That's what I understood, yes." Whitmer looked at the drive in his hand. "I've been building this for 8 months. Everything, every payment, every communication, every facility he targeted, and when and who inside each facility he used." He looked at her. "I want to cooperate. I've already contacted the prosecutor's office directly. This is the record they need to close every gap in the chain." Kellard arrived at that moment, coming through the kennel door at a pace that suggested he had also taken the stairs. He took in the scene, Whitmer, the drive, Claire's expression, Halsey on the floor, and said nothing immediately, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about Kellard. "He says he's cooperating," she said. "I know," Kellard said. "He called us 2 hours ago. We've been running background on him since." He looked at Whitmer. "The drive is real?" "Everything I had access to," Whitmer said. "It goes back further than Stormwall. Voss ran 2 other iterations before this one. Different company names, same architecture. The drive has the corporate lineage, the financial transfers, the equipment modification specs." He paused. "And the names of the other internal contacts. At every facility." The kennel was quiet, except for Kazan shifting his weight in the enclosure. Kellard took the drive. He bagged it with the practiced economy of someone for whom evidence handling was entirely routine, labeled it, sealed it. He looked at Whitmer. "You'll need to come with me." "I know," Whitmer said. He went, and Kellard went with him, and the kennel door closed behind them, and Claire was left with Halsey and the particular quality of silence that follows when something that has been building for a very long time has finally, audibly, stopped building and started falling. She sat down on the floor. Not planned. Her body made the decision. She ended up with her back against the wall beside Halsey, both of them at the same level. Kazan in his enclosure watching them both with the steady attention of a dog that had survived something and was still in the process of understanding that the surviving was done. "He really came to help," Halsey said. "I believe you," she said. "He looked terrified." "He was." She looked at Kazan. "People do useful things when they're terrified sometimes. Doesn't mean they weren't complicit in the thing that made them terrified. That's a complicated position. Most accurate things are." Halsey was quiet for a moment. Outside the kennel, somewhere above them, the building was doing what it was doing. Sen and her team and the prosecutors and the documents and the cascade of consequence that Whitmer's drive was going to accelerate in the morning. All of that was above them. Down here it was just the two of them and the dog and the cold floor, which was not comfortable but was, at this particular moment, exactly the right place to be. "What happens to you now?" Halsey said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know," she said. "Hartwell put me on administrative leave. The leave is under review pending the investigation outcome. They can't seriously maintain it. They might not have a choice. I violated 3 facility protocols in 48 hours. She paused. "I'd do it again." "I know," he said. "I know you would." She looked at Kazan. He looked back. His ears were forward, not back. A different posture than every time she'd seen him before, even in the good moments. Less guarding. More just present. "Is he going to be okay?" Halsey asked. "I don't know that either," she said. "Vasquez will tell us more when the blood work is complete. The behavioral recovery will take time. There's no clean timeline for this kind of thing." She paused. "But he's not running anymore. That's something." They stayed there another 20 minutes, not talking much. The floor stayed cold. At some point, Halsey's phone buzzed, and he looked at it and said that Sen wanted everyone in the conference room for a briefing at 7 a.m. Claire said she'd be there. He left. She sat a few more minutes alone. Then she got up, because sitting on kennel floors was not a sustainable professional strategy, and she had a 7 a.m. briefing to be coherent for. And at some point between now and then, she needed to sleep for a minimum of 4 hours, or she was going to be useless to everyone. She looked at Kazan one last time. "You did good," she said. "Whatever they told you about yourself, you did good." She drove home. She slept for 5 hours. She was back at Kestrel Ridge by 6:45, the 7 a.m. Briefing was in the large conference room, which had not previously been used for anything this size. Sen's field team, 2 federal prosecutors, a JAG officer named Devereaux, who had arrived overnight and had the look of someone who'd been working for 6 hours and considered that a warm-up, Halsey, Brannick via secure video from Northgate, and Vasquez, who had apparently also not slept and was running on the particular caffeine-assisted determination of a veterinarian who had spent the night completing a report he considered the most important of his career. Hartwell was there, sitting at the far end of the table with the careful posture of a man who understood he was present in an informational capacity rather than a command one, and who had made his peace with that distinction sometime in the previous 12 hours. Claire sat where there was a chair available, which was near the middle of the table, which put her between a federal prosecutor she didn't know and Kellard, who nodded at her once. Sen ran the briefing. She was efficient and precise and covered the ground without redundancy. The scope of the investigation, the confirmed facilities, the evidence chain from Kazan's intake through Whitmer's drive, the overnight analysis of the corporate lineage that went back 11 years and 3 company iterations, and a financial trail that connected to 7 government contracts totaling $42 million. She said Aldrin Voss, also known as Garrett Orrell, and 2 other names she cited without emphasis, had been formally charged overnight and would be transferred to federal custody that morning. She said Whitmer's cooperation agreement was in process, and his information had already materially advanced the prosecution case. She said the 9 confirmed animal welfare cases were being coordinated with a specialist from the Department of Defense's Working Dog Program who was arriving that afternoon. Then she stopped and looked at the room. "The investigation is active and ongoing," she said. "It will take time, but the architecture of what Voss built is exposed, and the evidence is in custody, and it is not going to be buried again." Nobody said anything immediately. The room had the quality of people absorbing something they'd been working toward and needed a moment to register as real. Then JAG Officer Devereaux said, "I need to address the matter of a sealed service record." Claire looked at him. Devereaux was compact and precise and spoke the way legal documents were written, every word in its correct location, nothing decorative. A formal review of Ms. Weston's previous service record has been requested by the IG Division in connection with this investigation. The review is specifically for the purpose of establishing her role in the original 2014 DoD inquiry and her professional qualifications relevant to this case. He looked at Claire directly. You'll receive formal notification today. The review doesn't unseal the record broadly. It establishes an investigative context, but it does mean that within this case, your background is documentable and your qualifications are on record. She looked at him. And my administrative leave? Hartwell spoke, which was unexpected. Not loudly. He said it at conversation level, from his end of the table. I'm rescinding the administrative leave effective today. The underlying conduct reviews have been vacated. He paused. The file in HR has been corrected. The room was very quiet. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not comfortable. He was also not wrong, which was probably costing him something, and she respected that it cost him something and he was doing it anyway. Thank you, she said. It was the most she said in the briefing. She spent the rest of it listening, making notes in the margin of the printed agenda that someone had placed at each chair. Not the notes of someone proving they were in the room, but the actual functional notes of a person who was going to need to act on this information and wanted to remember what it was accurately. After the briefing, she found Vasquez in the corridor. Full blood work, she said. Complete, he said. He handed her a tablet with the results pulled up. Chronic elevated cortisol, suppressed serotonin baseline, adrenal fatigue markers consistent with sustained involuntary stress response over at least 8 months, probably longer. He looked at her. It's exactly what you said it would be. How long for recovery? If the conditioning is stopped and he has proper care and consistent handler relationship, he paused. 6 months to baseline stabilization, maybe less, maybe more. Every animal is different, but possible. Entirely possible, he said. He's not broken. He's been hurt. Those are different things. She gave him back the tablet. The morning moved. She did not have a floor assignment because her reinstatement had just occurred and the scheduling system was not that fast. So she existed in the intermediate state of someone who was officially present and professionally unallocated, which gave her 3 hours of the particular freedom of a person who had nowhere specific to be and everywhere generally to go. She used it. She visited every patient on level 2 she had been managing before the suspension, updated herself on each one, talked to the 2 who were awake and coherent, made notes for the nursing team about what she'd observed. She found Durso in the supply room, the same supply room where she had told him to go do his job, and said, "You sent me the text about Vasquez being locked out." Durso looked at the floor. "I didn't think I should stay quiet." "You were right," she said. "Thank you." He looked up, surprised, as though he'd been expecting to be told off for it. "I'm serious," she said. "You took a risk and it mattered." He nodded once, tightly, the nod of a young person who was not yet practiced at receiving straightforward acknowledgement. She let him be. At 11:15, she went to level 1. The federal custody transfer of Voss, Oral, occurred at the main entrance at 11:40, which she did not witness directly, but which she heard about through Kellard, who texted her 2 words. He's gone. She stood in the level 1 corridor and received that text and let it mean what it meant, which was considerable and also not the end of anything except the particular threat that his presence in the building had represented. The end of the larger thing was going to take much longer. It was going to take depositions and testimony and legal process and the slow grinding work of prosecution, and she was going to be part of that work in ways she couldn't fully predict yet. And it was not going to be clean or fast or satisfying in the way of things resolved in a single room on a single night. But he was gone. She went into the kennel. Vasquez was finishing a follow-up assessment. Halsey was there, which had become a reliable fact. Wherever Kazan was, Halsey was within reasonable proximity, not hovering, not crowding, just present in the way he'd been on the floor the previous night. Something had shifted in how he occupied the kennel space. Less authority, more attention. It looked, actually, like he was learning something. She watched him work with Kazan for a few minutes. Halsey offered his hand. Kazan sniffed it and then pressed his head into it, and Halsey held still for it, not commanding anything, not directing anything, just receiving what was being offered, which was its own kind of lesson for a man who had spent his career giving orders. "He's eating better this morning," Vasquez said beside her. "Good. His engagement is up." He initiated contact with Commander Halsey twice without prompting. He paused. The stress response isn't gone, but he's not leading with it anymore. She watched Kazan move away from Halsey's hand on his own timing, circle the enclosure once, and come back. On his own, because he chose to. "Dr. Weston." She turned. Devereaux was in the doorway. He had papers. "It's Claire," she said. "Or Weston, not doctor." "The formal language is—" He stopped. "Claire, the record review is complete. I need your signature on the investigative context documentation. And there's a secondary matter." She went to him. He handed her the documentation. She read it, actually read it, all of it, which took 5 minutes, and during which time Devereaux waited with the patience of a man who had been in courtrooms and understood that reading was not delay. And then she signed where indicated. "The secondary matter," she said, "the DoD Working Dog Program Specialist arriving this afternoon, Major Orinda Breck. She's been building the case that initiated this investigation. She specifically requested that you be present for her assessment of Kazan and the other affected animals." He paused. "She also wants to discuss a formal role." "What kind of role?" "That's her conversation," he said. "But I was asked to tell you she's been aware of your work in the 2014 inquiry. She's familiar with your background, and she considers your involvement in this case to be—" he looked for the right word. She said indispensable. I'm told that's not a word she uses casually. Claire looked at the signed documentation in her hand. She thought about a woman named Sergeant First Class Orinda Breck, who had watched her dog change over 18 months and had spent those months building a case instead of accepting the change as inevitable, because she knew the difference between an animal that was failing and an animal that was being failed, and the difference mattered enough to her to fight for. Two people, at opposite ends of the same investigation, pulling toward each other for 8 months without knowing the other existed. "I'll be here," Claire said. Major Breck arrived at 2:10. She was a compact woman in her late 30s, Army branch insignia, with the particular economy of someone who had done an enormous amount of work in difficult conditions and had decided somewhere along the way that she didn't need to perform her competence for anyone. She came through the facility with Sen and Devereaux and stopped outside the kennel and looked through the door at Kazan and Halsey and was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Claire. "You're Weston." "Yes." "He's calmer than the report said to expect." "The report was filed yesterday morning," Claire said. "He's had time." Breck looked at her. There was an assessment happening. Not hostile, not skeptical, just the same quality of genuine attention that Sen had. The kind that felt less like judgment than like contact. "How did you know what the transmitter was?" Breck said. "I'd seen the design before." "In the 2014 inquiry." "Yes." "You were a medic attached to the K9 evaluation team." "Among other things," Claire said. Breck nodded once. It was the nod of someone who didn't need to hear more of a sentence once the relevant part had been confirmed. Claire recognized it as a professional habit she shared. They went in together. Kazan looked at Breck with the careful attention he gave to people he didn't know. Breck crouched down. She did not rush it. She let him take his time. When he finally came forward and put his nose to her hand, she didn't make anything of it. Just let it happen, noted it with the quiet precision of someone adding information to a picture she was building. "We have 11 confirmed animals across 9 facilities," Breck said, not to anyone specifically, to the room. "Every one of them has been documented as behaviorally deteriorating. Every one of them is currently under either a rehabilitation recommendation or a retirement recommendation, most of which were submitted by Stormwall's own contracted behavioral consultants. They manufactured the problem and sold the solution," Halsey said, repeatedly, profitably. Breck looked at Kazan. "These animals served. They did exactly what they were trained to do, in conditions most people can't fully imagine, for as long as they were asked to, and someone looked at that service record and saw a revenue stream." Her voice stayed level. The levelness was not absence of feeling. It was the opposite, feeling so present and so controlled it had become structural. "I filed the complaint 3 days before Kazan arrived at Kestrel Ridge because I had 12 months of documentation and a pattern that was impossible to ignore. But I didn't have the transmitter. I didn't have the physical evidence." She looked at Claire. "You had 48 hours. I had 14 months of knowing something was wrong about the environment, Claire said. I just didn't know what it was wrong about yet. Breck absorbed that. Then, I want to talk to you about the welfare assessment program for the 11 animals, and for any others we identify as the investigation expands. She paused. I need someone who can read the behavioral indicators, assist with the medical documentation, and work with the handlers on the recovery protocols. Someone the animals will accept. She looked at her steadily. The role is formal, DoD contracted. It's not a nursing position. Claire was quiet for a moment. What is it? She said. Officially? Specialist Advisor, Military Working Dog Welfare Program. It's a new designation. Devereaux is working on the formal structure. Practically, it means you're on the ground at whatever facility needs you, with full investigative access, until every affected animal has been assessed and the recovery protocols are in place. She paused. It means using the things you've been not using. Claire thought about a sealed record and a nursing degree, and 14 months of standard floor rotation and the specific deliberate smallness of a plan that fit on an index card. She thought about the index card and why she'd wanted it, and whether the thing she'd been protecting herself from by wanting it had actually been what she thought it was. She thought about B corridor, the flickering light. Kazan choosing her not because she was the most impressive person in the room, but because she was the only one who had stopped performing and started listening. I'm going to need my position at Kestrel Ridge to remain intact, she said. During any contracted work, I have patients here. Hartwell's already been informed, Breck said. He agreed. Of course he had. Then yes, Claire said. Breck nodded. She didn't smile. She wasn't, Claire was beginning to understand, a person who deployed smiles as punctuation. But something in her posture registered the word as the correct one and moved on from it, which was its own form of acknowledgement and suited Claire better than celebration would have. They spent the next 3 hours working. Breck and Vasquez on Kazan's formal welfare documentation, Claire on the comparative behavioral analysis across the 11 confirmed cases, pulling Vasquez's reports, and Brannick's Northgate assessment, and the preliminary data from the 7 other facilities, and building the kind of picture that required holding a lot of information simultaneously and finding the shape within it rather than imposing one on top. It was work she was good at. It was work she had not been asked to do in 14 months, and the experience of being asked to do it now was difficult to name precisely. Not triumphant, not emotional in any theatrical way, just the specific quiet satisfaction of a person given the right tool for the job they were actually equipped to do. At 5:30, the federal prosecutor's office released a preliminary statement. Kellard showed her on his phone. She read it standing in the kennel corridor. It named Voss, his 3 aliases, Stormwall Tactical Supply, and its 2 predecessor companies. It named the 11 facilities and the 9 affected animals currently under investigation. It named the total value of the fraudulent contracts. It named Donal Whitmer as a cooperating witness. It did not name Claire Weston. She noticed this and then noticed herself noticing it and found she didn't mind. The name wasn't the point. It had not been the point in B Corridor, and it had not been the point in the conference room at midnight, and it was not the point now. The point was a German shepherd in an enclosure who had stopped running. The point was 9 other animals in 9 other facilities who were going to be assessed and documented and given the care that should have been continuous rather than interrupted. The point was Orinda Breck, who had spent 8 months alone with her evidence and her certainty, waiting for the piece she didn't have yet. The point was that quiet people doing the actual work were not invisible. They were just operating in the register that didn't get heard until something made the room stop and listen. She found Halsey at the end of the day near the facility's east exit, where they had both come out through the previous night. He had his jacket over his arm. He looked like a man who had been awake for 36 hours and was planning to be awake for a few more before he let himself stop. What happens to him? Halsey said. Long term. Vasquez thinks 6 months to stable baseline if the recovery conditions are good, she said. Breck's program will structure the support. Handler continuity is a major factor. Meaning me. Meaning you, she said, if you want it. Halsey looked at the east entrance door. Not through it, at the push bar and the safety glass, and whatever was on the other side of both. I've been handling dogs for 15 years, he said. I thought I knew what I was doing. You did, she said. And then someone changed the conditions and you adapted to the wrong information. That's not the same as not knowing what you're doing. I should have noticed sooner. Yes, she said, and you didn't. That's a thing you're going to have to carry. She paused. But what you do with the carrying matters. And you've been on the floor of that kennel for most of the last 20 hours. He was quiet. Halsey, she said, he chose to come back to you every time. Even when everything else was wrong, he chose to come back to you. She met his eyes. Don't waste that. He looked at her, then he nodded once. The same nod Breck used, acknowledgement as action rather than performance. He went back inside. She stood at the east entrance for a moment. The evening was coming in across the parking structure, the light going that particular flat gold that didn't last. Somewhere in the building, the work was continuing. Documentation, coordination, the long institutional process of accountability finding its shape. It would not be fast. It would not be clean. There would be hearings and depositions and delays and moments where the machinery of justice moved so slowly it was indistinguishable from standing still. She had been through enough investigations to know that the moment of arrest was not the end of anything. It was just the beginning of the slower, less dramatic, more grueling part. But the transmitter was in evidence. Whitmer's drive was in evidence. Vasquez's reports were in evidence. And 9 animals in 9 facilities were going to begin, tomorrow or the next day, the work of recovering from something that had been done to them without their understanding and against their nature, with people beside them who had finally been told the truth. She thought about what Breck had said. Using the things you've been not using. She thought about a sealed room and a compromised ceiling and the decision she'd made at 26 about the cost of keeping a door open. She had thought she was protecting herself from something. She had been. But she had also been, she understood now, protecting the person she'd been from the person she was becoming, and at some point those were not the same operation. She had spent 14 months being called Whitmore. She had spent 14 months performing smallness so reliably that the person who'd placed her in that building had genuinely believed she would stay small. That was his mistake. Not the plan. The plan had been careful, and she could acknowledge that without pleasure. The mistake was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that a person who chose quietness was a person who could be managed, that a woman who did not announce her capabilities was a woman without them, that the absence of noise was the absence of substance. It was the same mistake that Hartwell had made, that Beverly Dawn had made, that Halsey had made in the intake bay when he'd looked at her like furniture. All of them working from the same template. Visible authority equals actual power. Announced competence equals real competence. And whoever isn't performing their importance must not have any. She had known since she was 22 that this was wrong. She had known it from the first time she'd walked into a room and been underestimated by everyone in it, and quietly done the thing that needed doing while they were all still performing their assessments of her. She had never been small. She had been strategic. There was a difference. She pushed through the east exit door and walked to her car in the last of the flat gold light, and she was tired in a way she hadn't been tired in a long time. Not the tired of overwork or suppressed frustration, but the tired of a person who had been holding something at extended arm's length for years and had finally, completely, been allowed to put it down. Her body was registering the end of a sustained effort. That was all. She sat in her car. On the floor of B corridor in the flickering light, a war dog had pressed his weight against her and she had let him. Not because she was exceptional, not because she had some unique and unteachable gift, because she had stopped and listened and given him the one thing that years of carefully engineered pain had made unimaginable to him. The possibility that someone in the room was not going to hurt him. That was not a complicated thing. It was the most basic thing, and it had been enough. She started the engine. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world without announcing themselves, who shows up and does the work and goes home and does not require the room to notice. The world has a tendency to confuse this with insignificance, to see the absence of performance and read it as the absence of value. Institutions are especially good at this mistake. They mistake volume for competence, title for authority, compliance for capability. And then something breaks. And the person they dismissed is the one standing in the corridor. Claire Weston had been dismissed, overlooked, suspended, mislabeled, placed under surveillance by a man who thought knowing where she was meant knowing what she was, and managed by a system that had never learned her actual name. None of it had made her smaller. It had only made the eventual correction larger. She pulled out of the parking structure into the evening. Behind her, in level 1, a German shepherd, who had been called dangerous and broken, and a liability, was lying in an enclosure with his head on his paws, breathing evenly, for the first time in longer than anyone had fully calculated. And tomorrow, a woman named Orinda Breck would begin the formal work of returning him to himself. And a handler who had been told he was losing his dog would learn that what he'd been losing was a version of the relationship built on the wrong information, and the real one, the one that had always been underneath, was still there, intact, waiting for the conditions that would let it breathe. Some things, when they have been deeply enough built, do not break under pressure. They only wait. She drove home. She would sleep. And in the morning, she would go back and do the work that needed doing, not because anyone had finally recognized her, but because the work was there and she was the person equipped to do it, and that had always been enough of a reason. It always had been. It always would be. She had spent 14 months being called Whitmore. She had spent 14 months performing smallness so reliably that the person who'd placed her in that building had genuinely believed she would stay small. That was his mistake, not the plan. The plan had been careful, and she could acknowledge that without pleasure. The mistake was the assumption underneath it, the assumption that a person who chose quietness was a person who could be managed, that a woman who did not announce her capabilities was a woman without them, that the absence of noise was the absence of substance. It was the same mistake that Hartwell had made, that Beverly Dawn had made, that Halsey had made in the intake bay when he'd looked at her like furniture. All of them working from the same template: visible authority equals actual power, announced competence equals real competence, and whoever isn't performing their importance must not have any. She had known since she was 22 that this was wrong. She had known it from the first time she'd walked into a room and been underestimated by everyone in it, and quietly done the thing that needed doing while they were all still performing their assessments of her. She had never been small. She had been strategic. There was a difference. She pushed through the east exit door and walked to her car in the last of the flat gold light, and she was tired in a way she hadn't been tired in a long time. Not the tired of overwork or suppressed frustration, but the tired of a person who had been holding something at extended arm's length for years and had finally, completely, been allowed to put it down. Her body was registering the end of a sustained effort. That was all. She sat in her car. On the floor of B corridor, in the flickering light, a war dog had pressed his weight against her and she had let him. Not because she was exceptional, not because she had some unique and unteachable gift, because she had stopped and listened and given him the one thing that years of carefully engineered pain had made unimaginable to him: the possibility that someone in the room was not going to hurt him. That was not a complicated thing. It was the most basic thing, and it had been enough. She started the engine. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world without announcing themselves, who shows up and does the work and goes home and does not require the room to notice. The world has a tendency to confuse this with insignificance, to see the absence of performance and read it as the absence of value. Institutions are especially good at this mistake. They mistake volume for competence, title for authority, compliance for capability. And then something breaks. And the person they dismissed is the one standing in the corridor. Claire Weston had been dismissed, overlooked, suspended, mislabeled, placed under surveillance by a man who thought knowing where she was meant knowing what she was, and managed by a system that had never learned her actual name. None of it had made her smaller. It had only made the eventual correction larger. She pulled out of the parking structure into the evening. Behind her, in level 1, a German shepherd who had been called dangerous and broken, and a liability, was lying in an enclosure with his head on his paws, breathing evenly, for the first time in longer than anyone had fully calculated. And tomorrow a woman named Orinda Breck would begin the formal work of returning him to himself, and a handler who had been told he was losing his dog would learn that what he'd been losing was a version of the relationship built on the wrong information, and the real one, the one that had always been underneath, was still there, intact, waiting for the conditions that would let it breathe. Some things, when they have been deeply enough built, do not break under pressure. They only wait. She drove home. She would sleep. And in the morning, she would go back and do the work that needed doing, not because anyone had finally recognized her, but because the work was there and she was the person equipped to do it, and that had always been enough of a reason. It always had been. It always would be.